welcome back to Soccer Supernova, a State of Mind's dedicated football chat show. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the journalist and broadcaster Charles Patterson. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Pleasure. It's nice to be inside this time capsule.
It is indeed. It's quite the work of art. It's quite the shrine, and there's a little bit of something for everybody. We'll kind of get right to it, as we were just kind of alluding to there, Charles. You had a 16-year career with Sky. Today is the day that obviously Steven Gerrard just joined Aston Villa. This is a little bit strange for you, getting to be able to come into here and not be breaking it.
It's nice to watch a story like that unfold, and I don't have to stress. I think stress is the right word. I was just saying to you before we went on air there that my focus today is picking up my children to go to their swimming lesson. And ordinarily a day like today would be very, very busy, and that's because ultimately this story has been rumbling for 2 or 3 days, and today's the culmination of it. So on the one hand, it's slightly weird and feels a bit alien not to be involved in it, but on the other hand, there is no kind of pressure there. So it's nice to kind of see something like that happen and develop, and I don't have to worry about where I need to be at 5 o'clock.
Like you say, you've had many days like today in a totally different, almost alternate universe. So if you were back in those days, or you were at Sky today, what would it look like being part of this breaking story?
Well, this story, I mean, I think it was confirmed this morning about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, the news that he had left to go to Aston Villa. But obviously, ever since he was first linked with the job at the start of the week, we would be all over it, speaking to both clubs at both ends, finding out what we needed to know. And there are reporters, of course, for Sky who would be finding out, not just myself, their own information, the ones based down in England as well. And depending on the relationship that you have with a particular club at any particular time, then you would go with that, and you would be doing live broadcasts for not just the television, but you would be maybe doing a podcast as well, and writing things up for the digital side. So it would be a full-on day or a full-on week as well. And this is happening, of course, at the moment in an international week. So Scotland are away playing this week, and you would have to balance that out as well in terms of whether you were involved in any of that coverage. So you're constantly on the wheel. I always likened the job to being like a hamster in a wheel, and you're constantly going, and you're waiting for the next thing to come, and you're looking for the next thing to come. So to have got off that wheel after 16 years has been a bit strange. And I can't deny that there's parts of it I'm missing, but there's also a lot of time for reflection, and I don't have to get up and be standing outside a football ground or inside a training ground at a particular time now, which is brilliant, because that is a bit of a life challenge when you've got a young family as well, and I've got a wife who works and has a proper, sensible job. So it's nice to kind of just step back, because life's too short. You can't keep doing that, I don't think.
Were these the kind of days, though, that made the job and made it all take over?
Yeah, you live for the big story, and you live for the buzz of something exciting happening. And of course, if you're looking at this story in isolation, the intrigue's going to be what happens next at the Glasgow end, and who's going to be the next Rangers manager. So there's loads of interest around that. And again, you'd be on the phone speaking to agents, you'd be trying to speak to the club, and they would probably not pick your phone up, but you would be trying to get as much information as you could out of the contacts that you had. So yeah, there's a massive buzz in that kind of thing, and that's one of the reasons that I got into journalism. I didn't fall into sports journalism because I wanted to be a sports journalist. I happened to want to pursue a career in journalism, and the sport element came along and welcomed me in, and I was lucky in that regard. And I think you get into it because you're intrigued about what's going on in the world. You want to ask people questions, and because you like writing stories or chasing stories or creating stories as well, which maybe other people don't know about. And a story like that, it's got national prominence. Everyone wants to talk about it who's remotely interested in football. Whereas there are a lot of little nugget stories out there which you get just as much pleasure of. But this is the kind of day where the focus would be on you to make sure you get the job done properly.
What was the bug that got you into sports journalism? As you say, it was journalism really as a whole, but then into the sports side of things.
Well, as a wee boy, I was always interested in watching the news, reading the papers, and there's a photo of me in my parents' house of me lying on the floor when I'm about 7 or 8 years old, about the same age as one of my boys are now, reading a newspaper with my news. I always had my nose in a book. I was a bit of a nerd as a kid, probably still am. And I was just fascinated by what was happening in the world. I did a history degree when I left school because I wanted to find out about stuff which I was interested in from a kind of research point of view. And I always had it in my mind that once I did that, and once I completed that, I would try and pursue the journalistic angle. And I did a postgrad, a 1-year postgrad, once I'd finished my history degree. But by then, I didn't even complete the postgrad because I was getting work experience and I was going out there and working for my local paper and doing it for free, which you did in those days. It wasn't a case of going and getting a placement or anything like that. It's like, yeah, I'll go off and I'll just work for free. And I did a bit of that at a radio station in the Borders as well. And I wasn't focused on sport. I've always had sport in my mind and in my life because I've always been a sports freak, but I didn't think I was going to go down into the world of sports journalism. And actually, it just so happened that I was lucky enough to be offered shifts at Sky Sports. And that was 16 years ago. And it just, again, it snowballed from there. And that was it. And eventually I got made permanent staff, and I was there for a very long time, almost half my life.
Absolutely, and everybody knows that, you know, Sky Sports HQ, it's all based down south. So what is it like being the one of only a few correspondents up here? You know, there is a Sky Sports Scotland team, obviously, and there's lots of guys kicking around, but you're working almost from afar with London being the headquarters. Yeah,
that was a difficult concept back in the day to get my head around, and it's changed. The channel has changed a lot. It's grown a lot. On a number of different levels, but from the point of view of me as an individual, I was working in a small kind of office dealing with a region. So I was focusing on what was happening in my region, and not just football, rugby as well, golf as well, other sports that might well have come across our radar. And on occasion, as I was learning the trade, I would go down to London and I would meet my colleagues who I didn't really know except speaking to them on the phone or hearing them in my ear. And then I got to realize that it was just a massive, I called it a sausage factory at times, because all the information would go in one end and it would come out the other side, compacted for the audience to read or to listen to. And that was quite difficult to get my head around, but then you realized where you fitted in terms of the place of the big machine. And yeah, and ultimately it's like anything else. You got used to the mechanics of the job and the technicalities around it. And so it was, but being a regional reporter gave you a little bit of autonomy to go off and find stories that would appeal to a wider audience. Living in Scotland, I think as a whole, not just in my job, but as a whole, we can get a little bit blinkered. We think that what happens in Scotland is more important than anything else that's going on in the rest of the United Kingdom. It was about trying to get a story that had a Scottish slant and spin it to a UK audience, and there's a certain skill to that. It's a national story, but on a local level, and if you can do that, then you would get people watching all around the world. I remember a story that I covered involving Albion Rovers, and this is 2008, 2009, and they were on the brink of going bust. And we went along to the ground in the summer, and the weeds were growing, and I don't know if you've ever been to Clifton Hill, by the way. It is a bit like this place. Yeah. It's a time capsule. It's never, it hasn't changed, and there were broken windows, and it just looked really sorry and neglected. And I spoke to the chairman at the time, and he said, we're close to going bust because people are coming in and trashing the place, in the off season, and the local kids are making a mess, and we don't have enough money to cut the grass or paint the fences and stuff. And we filmed a really nice feature, really nice bit of telly. And a few weeks later, he got back to me and he said, "You're not going to believe the uptake that we've had from that piece that went on Sky," because it was the summertime. There was a bit more downtime to get a feature like that on the telly. And they'd had folk from America and from the Middle East offering to contribute to the club, just small amounts to help with keeping the club afloat. And you almost felt like you'd done a duty, because that club is important to its community. And it was just a wee feature that we did to highlight the fact that the club might go out of business, and this was a club that's been around since the 19th century. But they got so much benefit from that 3 minutes of airtime and the way in which we shaped the piece that it helped them deliver investors to come in and give them a bit of money. And so it was weird to kind of think that a piece about Albion Rovers that I did was getting watched in about 180 countries around the world. And that's quite a hard thing to get your head around initially.
Yeah, it's a massive concept.
Aye.
And then kind of, going along those lines, like say in the summertime, it's a little bit easier because there is the downtime. But, and it's not just with Sky, it can be any of the broadcasters really. But the general consensus amongst fans is, that it's always, England first, Scotland second. How did you, as the front man ultimately of say Sky in Scotland, try and turn that negative really into a positive to go, no, the stories are here and they are getting shown.
Well, a good story is a good story no matter where it's sourced. But that concept, that I think it's a bit of a myth, that theory, because that's a Scottish mentality. Yeah. This is what I talk about. In Scotland, we can be quite insular, and we often only look, and this, not just in sport, I think in society in general, we often only look at what's in front of us and we think, this is the most important thing. Why are we not picking this up? Why are we not talking about this? This Stephen Gerrard's story is an interesting one in itself, because there'll be supporters of Scottish football, not just Rangers, but supporters of Scottish football who'll be looking at it and thinking, why is he going from the top team in Scotland to the 15th ranked team in England? Well, money for a start, and it's a bigger stage. That's a fact. And sometimes I think people in Scotland can be in denial about Scotland's place in the world, and that's not knocking Scotland at all, because this is my home and I love it. But you've got to understand sometimes that it's a big world out there, and people look at Sky's coverage of Scottish football at times and forget that Sky is a UK company. In fact, it's a global company now. It's not just about what's happening in Scotland. So it's about a good story, but equally it's also about what is going to register with not just the Scottish audience, but a UK audience, a global audience. And from a global perspective, when you think of Scotland and football, you think of Celtic, you think of Rangers, you think of the Scotland national team and the Tartan Army. And then there are these little nuggets on wonderful kind of fairy stories, like Gretna reaching the cup final all those years ago, or these little clubs in the lower leagues that do wonderful things for the local community. And if the story was there and there was a hook to it and it made sense to the wider audience, then we would be encouraged to go and cover it. And I think that doesn't matter whether it's Sky or anybody else. National papers would go and do stuff like that. And, you see, this is a wonderful country with so much fabric and depth to it across sports and society. There's great stories out there. It's just finding the right way to pitch it to the audience that you want to pitch it.
You obviously, as you've said, you grew up on the east, like myself and like all of us through here. As you kind of did say, it's Celtic, Rangers, Scotland. That's kind of the world that really we live in up here. How was it, even though you are aware of the Glasgow Cauldron, whatever you want to call it, you are almost an outsider going right into the depths of the cauldron?
It was weird when I first moved to Glasgow. I'd spent time in Glasgow, but I never really appreciated what it was like to live in Glasgow. I remember going through there about 6 months after I started working at Sky, and it was a slight eye-opener. I'm married to a girl from Maryhill who was living in Edinburgh when I met her, and I was living in Glasgow, and I ended up coming back through. That was my excuse to cut and run back to the east, where I kind of understood people.
Felt comfortable.
Well, no, not so much that. Glasgow's a brilliant place. Brilliant place. Everyone's mad about their football, mad about their sport, and it's a different vibe as a city compared to Edinburgh. Edinburgh's a slightly more, I would say, international outlook city, slightly more reserved. Yeah. If you meet people and talk to people, Glasgow's, I couldn't get over for the first 6 to 9 months how friendly folk were and how in their face they were. They would speak to you and ask you questions, even if you didn't want to be asked questions. But a brilliant place to live and brilliant place to work. But it was weird getting into the kind of whole mindset around the fact that, in the sporting context, the Old Firm mattered big time. Mattered so much to not just
what was happening in the sporting world, but to the whole element of society, people living and breathing it on the Clockwork Orange, you know. On a Saturday when you saw people going to Ibrox, or you saw fans heading east towards the East End to go to Celtic Park, it's just, they're just big institutions, massive institutions. I mean, and that was a real eye opener for a wee boy who grew up playing golf, because that's what I did. I mean, I had no idea that until I really moved to Glasgow and lived in Glasgow, that they were that big in terms of their reach, the tentacles that reach into the depths of the city.
Obviously, the longevity of your time at Sky, you covered, you know, the kind of mid-noughties when it was toe-to-toe Celtic Rangers, then obviously there was the Rangers demise, and then the Celtic total rise. So talk us through that, you know, probably the really early days of your time at Sky had been, you know, Strachan and Smith, and they were the really competitive times, probably the last 20 years, the most competitive time.
There hasn't been a title race, really, to speak of, since Walter Smith retired. And I've, you know, to go on record and say what an amazing guy to have to interview and work alongside, and terribly sad about his passing recently. But he was, you know, a kind of iconic figure, really, in terms of my development as a journalist. He and Gordon Strachan were very, very good at making you think about the questions you had to ask them. And they built solid teams that you could rely on not to collapse in the closing stages of a title race or implode at various points in the season. You know, they didn't do that. They really didn't. And the 2008 season, when Rangers reached the UEFA Cup final, Celtic got to the last 16 of the Champions League, Scotland nearly reached the Euros that year. I mean, that season was incredible. Even Aberdeen, they went and played Bayern Munich in the UEFA Cup, the old UEFA Cup. And it was big game after big game, and they were like two heavyweights fighting blow for blow at the top, and they had teams pushing below them. And in the background, you had a story like Hearts with Romanov in charge, which was just completely off the scale bonkers in its own right. And that was happening in the background. And that wasn't even a big deal, because there was so much stuff going on, and Scottish football was on a real rise at that point. And that was a kind of season that I will look back on even in 10, 15, 20 years' time. I think that was one of the best seasons to be involved in terms of my job. I was absolutely full on in my job at that point. And it was phenomenal to be part of it, you know, from a journalistic perspective, getting to go to these big games. But the two managers in particular, they were absolutely forensic when they listened to you. And if you didn't get the question right, then they would throw it back at you and they would challenge you on it. And that was a real education for me as a journalist, asking good questions, learning to ask a proper question. There's an art to that. I think it's very easy to make statements when you're interviewing somebody. It should be the fundamentals of asking who, what, where, when, how, why. And a lot of, I think, I look at the media now and I think it's very easy, and you see a lot of people maybe don't subscribe to that sometimes. You had to ask the right question to Walter or to Gordon, or you'd be in trouble.
What do you think made them so, you know, media savvy? Because, as you see, managers now perhaps let journalists off, and vice versa. Journalists perhaps let managers off, and they don't quite get to the crux of the question. But Strachan and Smith, like you say, one word wrong or missed more like, then you weren't going to get the answer that you were craving. I
think part of it's a game, part of it's a bit of fun back and forth. I think there's also an element of some people in if we're talking about football, I think there's some people who are happy to kind of have a good relationship with journalists. There's a lot of people in football who don't want any relationship with the media at all, rightly or wrongly. But the media's job in any walk of life is to scrutinise and to ask questions. And that's not to say you're trying to stitch people up. This was in an era still when tabloid newspapers in particular would quite often go after certain celebrities in a news sense. And I think they still do to a point, but there's always been, I think, in a footballing context, an element when if you're a young player coming in, you're briefed, be
aware of the journalists, they're going to try and stitch you up. From a TV perspective, I was always slightly kind of frustrated about that, because I was like, we're trying to promote the product here,
Yeah.
and we're not trying to make life difficult for you. We're trying to work with you. We want to get something that's really good to kind of put on the television or get a nice feature here. And it was always easier when you were sitting in a one-to-one environment to do that rather than in an open press conference. And you could tell with Walter Smith or with Gordon Strachan, they'd come in and the radar would immediately be on. And they'd be sitting there. I mean, I remember Walter Smith that season when they got to the UEFA Cup final. He was doing a press conference every other day.
Yeah.
And he'd come in and he'd look at me and go, right, what you got for me today? Because quite often I would be asked to go and ask the kind of question of the day, which every manager in the country would be getting asked. And he'd be looking for the curveball from me. And on occasion, he might humour me and give me an answer. But he'd be like, nah. Usually it was, no, son. No, I'm not answering that. Don't be daft. But there was a mutual respect there, because he understood that there was an element of the media's job that he could actually use to his advantage to get his message across to the supporters. Sometimes they get his message across to the players. Gordon Strachan did the same thing. Before them, Alex Ferguson has been doing that. I think the old school generation, for using a cliche, were masters at doing that. And I do believe probably there are a lot of managers nowadays that still do that, who've learnt from guys of that older generation. But young players and managers now have all got social media accounts. Everyone's on Instagram, Twitter, and actually you can get your own message out there now without having to use the media. So it has fundamentally changed now, the relationship between the media and footballers here sitting in 2021 compared to what it was when I started in 2005. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I don't think it'll ever be the same. And I think that's just an evolution thing. It's a bit sad. You can still be tight with people. You can still have great off-the-record conversations with folk. But I don't think it will ever be quite the same. And COVID has accentuated that change as well, because you can hardly be in the same room as anyone now. But the great managers, the great manipulators of the media in football were the ones who were successful in getting their message across, and at the same time being not afraid to be challenged. And there's not many of them, in my view. And Walter Smith was one of the last. He was a kind of a dying breed,
Did you ever receive the Walter glare?
Yeah, I did.
Did you?
Aye, but I've said this before. I worked out my own personal solution to it. So I am dreadfully short-sighted. I've got contact lenses in at the moment. But if he was doing a morning press conference, quite often I'd drive through from Edinburgh to Glasgow, and you don't want to put your lenses in too early because it's a long day. So I'd drive and wear my glasses, and I'm sitting down in the press conference, and if there was an awkward question I needed to ask, I would take my glasses off. And if I was wearing my glasses here, sitting speaking to you just now, I wouldn't be able to see you. I'm that bad. The prescription's like 6 or something like 5.75. And I would be asking this awkward question, and I wouldn't even be able to see his response. So I'd be sitting there blind, blissfully unaware that he was drilling his eyes into me. So yeah, I did receive the stare, but equally, it was nothing personal. But that was my own way of dealing with it.
You talk about personal there, and it is a working relationship between the journalist and manager, player, whoever it may be. But how do you make sure, or protect yourself almost, that because things will be said to you, or an answer to your question told to bugger off, to be polite. How do you make sure that you don't take that home, you don't take it personal? Because at the end of the day, you are indeed human. Yeah,
I think when you're younger, you do. You kind of question yourself and you think, oh, what have I done wrong here? He's never going to speak to me again. I mean, there are occasions where people have crossed the line and then they get banned. And, it's, and sometimes relationships are irreparable. I think it's all about respect. I mean, in the media, especially if you're dealing with celebrities, whether it's sport or not, it can be any kind of celebrity. There's an understanding that the media are going to ask questions that perhaps people sitting there being interviewed are not going to like. But if you do it in a respectful way, if you treat people with respect, and if you talk openly and honestly and give them time to answer, then I think ultimately, however awkward the question is and however strained that might be as a situation, at the end of the day, you can still shake hands and say, look, I have my job to do. And the individual concerned can turn around and walk away and appreciate that. I mean, I had to interview
managers were on the brink of losing their jobs, and this is about your financial security as a human being. And it was my job to ask the questions that supporters wanted answered. And it's not about, do you think you're going to get sacked? It's more about asking the question of, do you feel secure in your job? Do you have the support of the people above you? What would you say to your supporters in order to convince them that you're still the right person to lead this team forward, and such line and so forth? And that's an awkward business, especially in the tunnel after a game when your team's lost. There's a manager, and I'm not going to name names here, but there's a manager who I had to do that interview with for more than one job on more than one occasion. And it felt like, history was repeating itself the second time. And you could tell, you knew that that from the vibe of the crowd that they'd had enough. They wanted this guy out. And there's a part of you that feels sorry for him, but equally there's a part of you that thinks, well, I've got a good story here. I might get a really good answer here. And that's the cruel world of the industry. But I think if you're getting into football and you're getting into the world where it's going to be high intensity, high pressure, high scrutiny, you kind of need to suck it up a bit and just accept that that's part of the reality of it. And part of the reality of it is that someone like myself would come along and ask questions. It's the entertainment business at the end of the day. That's what it is. I mean, football is entertainment. Sport is entertainment, and people lose their jobs and win trophies as part of that.
Kind of the clip that's going down today, and it's from when Emma Dodds asked Steven Gerrard, are you settled? Are you happy? And he says, yes, of course. Don't ask silly questions. I don't think Emma Dodds said anything wrong. It was obviously surrounding the Newcastle job, I think, at the time. That was one that was linked to. Obviously, 2 weeks later, it doesn't reflect well on himself, the fact that he's left. But do you think that she was right in everything that she'd done there?
Yeah, she was absolutely right. And I think it's also to look at that and to say that it doesn't reflect well on Steven Gerrard, I think is slightly unfair, because at that time, the Aston Villa job wasn't available. And the Aston Villa job became available at the start of this week, and 4 days later, Steven Gerrard is the manager of Aston Villa. So again, it's a slightly hypothetical situation to reflect on. But anyone who thought that Steven Gerrard was going to stay at Rangers for the rest of his managerial career was living in cloud cuckoo land, just as anyone who even contemplated that Brendan Rodgers was going to stay at Celtic beyond his shelf life there would again be slightly living in an alternative universe. That's what happens when you come and manage one of those two clubs. If you do well, you're going to end up in England. That's a fact, whether people who support either two club like it or not. The question that Emma asked was relevant at the time. Me personally, I might have asked this slightly differently, but she asked a perfectly legitimate question. And Stephen's answer, I've had a couple of back and forths with him in the tunnel before. He quite enjoys the back and forth banter with the television journalists in particular, and part of that I think is it's slightly an act. It's slightly a game to be showing his supporters as well, and his staff and his players, that he's on the front foot and he's not getting thrown by that. And that's what, especially if you're on the television, everything's videoed now. Yeah. I think if you're in a position like that, you want to be seen to be in control. And you look at the current Celtic manager, he's bitten a few heads off since he took charge this summer, and I can understand why he's doing it. I think sometimes the smart managers will do it at the right time, and the ones who aren't so smart may do it and actually find that sometimes it backfires on them. But again, it's all part of the fun, part of the entertainment.
Absolutely, and it is entertainment. But do you think something like that with Steven Gerrard in particular, it perhaps comes with the name, that they're stepping into the name, Gerrard is stepping into the Scottish game, and as you say, it's rightly so. It's that narrow-minded, perhaps Scottish perspective, but we are a stepping stone. Anybody up here is a stepping stone to get that job down south. But do you think there's almost not an arrogance at all, but the name Gerrard is in the game? I'm up here. I'm the guy.
That's difficult. I don't really know him as a person. This guy's a worldwide footballing icon. Yeah. I have to say, every dealing that I've ever had with him, very respectful, really straight down the middle. You could chat to him off the record, but equally, when he was on the record in front of camera, he knew what he wanted to say, and it was prepared, and he would say it. And it was very rare that you could throw him with anything. I did try latterly to not ask him the obvious question first, because these guys are all prepared.
Comfortable. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. They would be meticulously prepared before they come into especially a broadcast interview, about what they wanted to say, how they wanted the message to get across, and they would know which questions would be coming. And I would always try and mix it up a bit, part of the fun. And I do remember there was one last year that I came at it from a completely different angle to perhaps what he had expected, and he just looked at me and said, it was almost as if, why are you asking that one first? And then I asked the question he thought I was going to ask first. I asked it third. I was probably trying to be a smart arse in my own head. But equally, I was, when you're interviewing the same person 50, 60, 70 times a season, you've got to make it slightly different. Otherwise, it's not going to run on air. Exactly. So even if it is the Rangers manager, or the Celtic manager, or the Scotland manager. So there are a lot of these guys who love doing the media, and there's some of them that hate them. Some of them absolutely detest it.
How do you deal with that? Because being in it
just
for
be
so
nice.
Just
Amy.
be nice.
Yeah, be nice. Be respectful. Go in with a smile on your face, and it's not about going in that being daft and having a grin, and it doesn't mean anything. But if you interview somebody who's genuinely not wanting to be on camera, especially young players or younger people who've never done an interview before. I mean, I would go up to people in the street and ask them for their opinions about things, vox pops, and quite often you'd see people shrink away from the camera and run away. You have to make them feel at ease. It's like anything else. I mean, we're sitting having a chat now, and there's 2 microphones in front of us, but you wouldn't know that because we're talking and having a discussion about something which is easy because it's subject matter that we're both familiar with, but equally it's not a kind of pressurized situation. You want to make people feel like whoever they are, whether they're an individual in the street, a young player, or the world's leading football manager who's won 50 trophies, you want to make them feel like they're comfortable speaking to you. And that comes with just having a good manner, I think, and being able to break the ice beforehand as well. That helps. Off camera or before the interview started, and that's sometimes difficult. But if it's live, then you say, "Listen, this is live. It will probably be about 2 minutes long," and then the person in their own head is right. Okay, here we go. No problem. That's fine. And whenever it was someone in the street, I'd say, "By the way, this is not live. There are no live trucks here. If you say something wrong, we can re-record it. Don't worry." And I always said that live was easier because you wanted to just let it go.
Yeah.
And me as a live broadcaster with my experience, if the conversation started to dry up, I could then just ask another question and move it on a bit. Because ultimately you want that person to forget that the camera's even there. And that you want to have them zoned in, focusing on you. So that was the thing that I always tried to do, whichever environment I was in. But if it was an awkward situation and there were difficult conversations to be had, you still do it with your smile on your face. You're not trying to, with the greatest respect to Jeremy Paxman, I wasn't trying to be Jeremy Paxman and embarrass these people.
Yeah.
There's no point in embarrassing somebody because, especially in sport, there's a good chance that person's going to be coming back around to you next week or the week after. You can still get what you want, but do it in a respectful manner.
Not so much perhaps with interviews, and they are more now coming back to be in person, but the press conference dynamic, I'm still going to press conferences and they are over Zoom. Do you think COVID, the aftermath of COVID, it will totally change the game there? Because I've obviously only known press conferences being over Zoom. I find them extremely difficult. And
they're not great.
They're not great. And you can kind of, I think, the journalist, can shrink a bit, I certainly can feel a little bit small, but I think the manager, it's easier, or the player, to divert. I've had one before that it wasn't me asking the question, but they just went, "Oh, poor connection, move on."
Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same. You would sit in a press conference room at Rangers when Walter was in charge, and he would come in and he would come and sit down and he would say, "Morning, gentlemen, how you doing?" And then quite often, if there was something he wanted to get across before the press conference started, he'd say, "Listen, off the record, just let you know, this has happened or that's happened. I don't want to talk about this, don't want to talk about that, but fire away." And you would get it's proper conversations. On Zoom, it is so stilted now, and it's a sign of the times at the moment in the world that we live in, and I totally understand it from COVID regulations perspective that they don't want masses of journalists inside the training ground. I can totally concur with that. And if you're a host broadcaster, actually, you're in a lucky position at the moment. My former colleague Luke Shanley has been out with the Scotland squad out in Spain ahead of the games
and he's been in a one-to-one environment, and so that's natural, that's normal. But equally, it's still not the same, because you got the 2 meter distance, and you can't really chat off the record quite as easily. And there's more PR now in sport than there ever has been. So, I don't think it will ever change. Do I think that we'll get rid of Zoom press conferences? I hope so. I'm done with Zoom. I don't know about you. It works great, and it serves a purpose, but I think it's also leading to a downgrading of the quality of journalism in sport. I think it's leading to an acceptance of poor Wi-Fi connections on your television. It's a digitization thing, and that's my view. There are places, especially if you're filming outside, you can still go out and do normal interviews and whatnot. But press conferences with loads of people in them, you don't see them very often at the moment for the reasons that we've described. And I hope that they come back, because actually you do need them. You need a room. Sometimes you would be in a press conference and you'd be in a room and you're like, this is going to be a big deal, this. You could feel it. I remember being in, where was it? We were in Belgium. Scotland got beaten by Belgium, and it was Craig Levine's last game. And they got beat 2-0. It could have been about 10-0. What a place to watch a game, by the way.
Really?
When that place is rocking. Yeah, great. And just at the end of the game, some of the Tartan Army put up a wee banner and it said, Strachen, SOS. And we kind of knew that Craig's time was going to be up. And Craig walked into the room, and there was maybe half a dozen broadcasters in there, and certainly there were about 10 press guys. And he just looked like he knew it was over. We knew it was over, but you couldn't recreate that on Zoom. That atmosphere, that kind of, that tension in there in the room, it was palpable. And because of that, he knew it, and he was looking around. He was like, "Where's the grenade coming from?" And somebody was going to ask the question, "Is that it?" And it did get asked. And I remember being in that room, and I was like, "This is game over." And it was game over a few days later, unfortunately for Craig. But that environment is a unique one, especially if if a manager walks in being presented as the new manager. It's a big deal, that, for a lot of clubs. So Rangers are looking for a new manager. Presumably they'll want to present him. How are they going to do that under COVID circumstances? I don't know. Celtic did that in summer, but the weather was good. You were able to do loads of stuff outside. Are they going to be able to have a big press conference, without people having masks and stuff on at Rangers in the Blue Room at Ibrox, which is a pretty confined space? I don't know. But you need to have that kind of set piece press conference once in a while. Those are big issues and big deals,
Talking about almost the new normal that we've came to know it as well as press conferences. There's been a real emergence of fan media press conferences, especially to the tail end of your time at Sky Sports. How do you feel about the prevalence of fan media, particularly in Scotland? I think on Monday Celtic hosting a fan media one with Ange Postecoglou. The prominence and prevalence really is stepping up in the game up here. How do you feel as a rivalry with traditional mainstream media? As a partnership? Where can it go?
I think it's partnership. I think there's a place for it, absolutely. And ultimately, in football, the club and the management and the players are held to account by the fans, and then the mainstream media. The cliches and the hyperbole around the mainstream media and their value or otherwise to Scottish football or to sport in general is slightly overblown. There will always be a place for that, for the casual observer to go to. But for the hardcore supporter, I think it's really, really relevant. What it shouldn't do is replace. They should work alongside. And there's always been fanzines. Before you were born.
Yeah. Before you as well.
Well, yeah, it's true. I mean, the thing that I find sad is that the demise of the matchday programme, that's going to start drifting away, and that was
Hibs are the first.
Well, Hibs have decided that they don't want to continue that anymore, and they've got their reasons for it. But the matchday programme was a kind of voice to the fans.
As well.
Yeah, well, a memento firstly, and then also a voice. From the club towards the fans, and then the fanzines would be almost like a kind of counterbalance to that. And
And so it's developed because of technology. And I mean, it's great that people can podcast now from their front rooms, and people can ultimately go and do stuff like that, and ask questions of their heroes and ask questions of the people that they support. I think you've got to, though, adhere to the same standards of your fan media of holding people to account. There's a difference between being a journalist and holding a big football club or a national association to an account and being a fan of that. I mean, I'm a Scotland fan, but if Scotland were terrible and played badly, then you've got to absolutely scrutinise it fairly and objectively and not be blinkered. Ultimately, fans across the planet are blinkered. Bottom line, whether they like to admit it or not, every fan is a fan. The term fan obviously comes from the term fanatic. They're blinkered. I am a Green Bay Packers fan for my sins. And I do a podcast with some friends, and they rip me merciless about the current state of play at the Green Bay Packers and the quarterback banging on about homeopathy to avoid getting COVID and all this nonsense. But because I'm a fan, I am slightly biased in my outlook. Just slightly. Every fan is biased, whether they like to admit it or not. Whereas if you look at something objectively, as a journalist, you have to, in my view, park your objectivity. The moment you sign up on the dotted line, this is the job I'm doing, you have to be objective. Even if you're a Scotland supporter, I mean, it's great if Scotland got to the Euros and everyone was cheering, the whole country was going nuts. But equally, if they hadn't, we would have had to analyse objectively why they hadn't done it. And I think fans can do that, but they can be pulled by the heartstrings. And that's nothing wrong with that. But that's why I don't think that it will ever fan media is not going to ever take over, because you will always have that objectivity out there at the same time.
As you say, you are a Scotland fan. You've had the 16 years of work and covering the absolute disasters, the Craig Levein years and everything. And just as you leave, qualify for Euros, World Cup playoff place beckons. Is it a sin that you never got to cover Scotland?
Well, I did. I was at the Euros.
Well, you were at the Euros
I was at the Euros, at the World Cup.
Yeah.
So I remember when they qualified for the World Cup in '98, and we all legged it out of school to go and watch the Brazil game. And that was sensational, but you took it for granted in those days. And yeah, it was quite hard going to some games over the last 10, 15 years and thinking we're going to get absolutely roasted in this match here, or just another example of Scotland's ineptitude. So it's been terrific to cover them in the last couple of years, and the dramas of getting through to the Euros was brilliant. It was wonderful to cover Scotland at a major tournament. It's been a massive bucket list. I was lucky enough to go to the Women's World Cup in 2019 and cover the Scotland team there. That was phenomenal, because not just to kind of see the growth of women's football, but to be following Scotland at an international tournament. Brilliant. I mean, that's what you sign up for when you do this job. And so that was terrific. And I was away in France for 3 weeks, and classic Scotland imploded in the final game.
Obviously.
In magnificent style.
That's emphatic fashion, even in Scotland.
I know. I mean, the country's got a history of massive calamities, but that was right up there. And it's great that they appear to be in pretty safe hands at the moment with Steve Clarke. And I've done a lot of away trips. I've been to probably 70 odd Scotland games, so it's nice to sit back and look at it as a fan again now. Just sitting back and watching it from afar is quite nice to do that. I'm intending to go, if assuming they get to the playoff, I'm intending to go to the playoff in March. If it's at home at Hampden, that'll be great to cover that. And whether I go from a working perspective or whether I go as a supporter, I don't know. But I'm not going to go to the World Cup. I don't think I would be allowed to go to the World Cup unless someone pays me to go there and work for them. But I don't intend to go to Qatar. But it'd be great, I think, for a younger generation to see Scotland at a World Cup on their TV screens. And it was brilliant for the Euros as well. My kids got right into it. I've got 2 wee boys who are in primary school, and they both got their Scotland strips, and they were collecting their Panini stickers and stuff. And that's part of growing up, seeing your country doing really, really well. And I loved it. I love following Scotland because you felt invested in it.
Yeah.
It was brilliant.
To make your work easier, because you're seeing at home is with your boys, but you're seeing the impact that it's having on the country. Like as you said, that was my first tournament with Scotland making a major tournament in the summer, and everybody, I've obviously got friends who don't have a clue about football, but they just get invested in it. Does it make the working life a little bit easier?
Yeah, because if you say to people, I'm going to the game, I went to the Czech Republic game. Oh, brilliant, you're going. You couldn't get a ticket for love nor money, of course. And to cover that game and go to the Croatia game despite the results, and to see the England game, brilliant. I mean, that's why you want to be there, and that's why you're part of the job, and it does make your life easier. And Scotland fans are a great bunch. Tend to be slightly imbibed with beer most of the time when you interviewed them, but a great bunch. And you'd see the same guys on the same trips. Yeah. And they would see you and brilliant, you interviewed me in Slovenia, it's great to see you in Macedonia, and all that jazz. And these guys were diehards. Yeah. But to go and cover these games and see Scotland do quite well was a good feeling to go away. And the one that I've always said stood out was the one in Croatia when they went out there not long after Gordon Strachan took over, and Croatia were number 4 in the world, and they were meant to absolutely destroy Scotland that day. And Scotland won 1-0. And afterwards, Gordon Strachan lost his rag with the Croatian media who were in the huff. And we had a great trip home. Everyone was bouncing. But we all thought that they were going to get annihilated. Yeah. And we were taking... The guys in the press some of us were doing sweepstakes on what the score was going to be pre-match. And then Scotland won 1-0. Phenomenal. And that's part of the fun, and of doing the job. That was really wonderful to do that.
Do you think Scotland are probably set, probably best they have been in the last maybe 20 years, especially during your time in the media?
Yeah, at the moment. I think Steve Clarke's comfortable in the job. I don't envisage, from speaking to him over the last few years, that he is in a rush to leave it. It suits him from a personal perspective. He's signed a new contract recently to go to 2024. Even if they don't get to the World Cup, they're in a good spot to maybe get to the next Euros. There are the good thing about the SPFL is it's a great breeding ground for young Scottish players to get lots of game time and push to get into the Scotland squad. Someone like David Turnbull, for example, Nathan Patterson, young players at Hearts, at Aberdeen, at Hibs, at Dundee United. These guys get loads of game time in a tough environment, and then they get themselves to a point whereby the next step is perhaps you move down south, which again is a fact of being a Scot, is if you want to be really, really great, you go down south ultimately. And at the same time, you quite often see them breaking into the Scotland squad. And, for a time, I think there was a talent drain in the early 2000s. Perhaps that has been fixed now. I think the SFA did a lot of good work in terms of their performance schools, and clubs are now focused on developing young players through their academies now, which maybe they weren't 20 years ago. And obviously the bottom fell out financially of Scottish football quite a while ago for various reasons, and it now appears to be getting back on its feet slowly. But as long as clubs continue to produce good young players, and those good young players keep getting chances, and then ultimately going and playing abroad, or in England, I should say, then you will always have a good pool of players available for the national team. And then you've got obviously one or two that come in, such as someone like Brown, who's obviously coming into the squad this week, or Dykes, the guys who wouldn't necessarily think immediately are Scots. Like Shea Adams, yeah. So, yeah, I think it's looking good. Ultimately, it comes down to you got me the right appointment as a coach. Steve Clarke's a great appointment. Great appointment. Gordon Strachan did a good job, I think, in difficult circumstances. And then they've obviously got Alec McLeish back, and that for a variety of reasons didn't work. But equally, if people forget the first time he was in charge, he took on what Walter Smith had built. So Alec had a track record, so I can understand why they went for him. You got to make the right appointment, and it's international managing. It's difficult because you're spending a lot of time twiddling your thumbs. You got to be the right character to do it.
Was club manager Strachan different to international manager Strachan?
Yeah, very much different.
Even in just a conversation and a press conference? He
was much more relaxed when he was at Scotland. It suited him down to the ground. He loved the job. Absolutely loved it. He mellowed a bit. I think he'll tell you himself, but I think he disliked the intensity of the Glasgow Goldfish Bowl. He didn't like that scrutiny, that day-to-day scrutiny, people on phone-ins, and You know, the fact that you could drive along the street in Glasgow and someone would be lobbing abuse at you, I think he hated that. Whereas in Scotland, everyone's behind you. Everyone wants you to win. Everyone wants you to be successful. And he was great to deal with from a Scottish perspective. But I think he just found it slightly frustrating that he just never quite had the team right. And by the end, actually, they were playing pretty well, but there were a few games that they made a bit of an arse of it, shall we say.
Nicely. You speak about, you know, the guys from up here going down south, your Robertson, Tierneys, McGinns. You've had a long career up here, and you talk about the little features that you do. Who's kind of the players that you've perhaps monitored, spoke to at a young age, and you've watched them, you know, have that progression, because you've had that front row seat?
Yeah. I remember when Tierney got his debut at Celtic, and he'd already been raved about, but he was very slight. He was a wee guy, and you thought, oh, and he could barely talk to you as well. He was very shy, but then the word was that this was the next big thing, and you do kind of wonder. I mean, at that age, when they're 17, 18, 19, players can go one of two ways. I think they do go, or they, for whatever reason, there's a roadblock that just stunts their development, stunts their growth. But he was, as soon as Brendan Rodgers came in, he just went stratospheric, and you could see the development day by day, and that comes from good coaching. Other players that, you know, I remember interviewing John Fleck when he was 15, and he was the captain of the Scotland under-16 Victory Shield squad.
Really?
And it was one of the most difficult interviews I've ever done, because he was just not ready to do an interview. No one had given him media training. This would have been 2007 or 2006. And bear in mind, he's still in and around the Scotland squad now, so that shows how long ago that was. And again, he was touted as the next Wayne Rooney at the time, and he played in the cup final in 2008 when he was 16. And then it just didn't quite work for him, and it took him a long time to grow and mature. But at that time, people were saying, this guy's going to be Scotland's saviour. And look what has happened. Eventually, in his late 20s, he's blossomed at Sheffield United, and he's got Scotland cap. So he was always an international standard player, but you just don't know how people's careers are going to develop, whether through injury or through lack of opportunity, or sometimes personal stuff in your own head as a player perhaps affects you. And I mean, I never saw John McGinn being the superstar he's become. I freely admit I didn't think that he was that level.
Yeah. But
he proved me wrong, you know, and great. I mean, what a lovely guy to deal with as well. Brilliant guy. I remember watching Ryan Gauld score at McDermott Park, and I went on and interviewed Jackie McNamara afterwards. And I said, how good is this kid, do you think? And he said, oh, well, he'll be as good as he can be, but he's still young. We'll keep our feet on the ground. And he would have been 17. And again, he was tiny. Absolutely. I mean, he would have been barely a spot over 5 foot. And then the next thing, he's off to Sporting Lisbon. And that was a long time ago. He signed for Sporting Lisbon. You know, you're talking 7 years ago now. And he's now in Vancouver. And there are some people who say, okay, he should be in the Scotland squad. And I think that there's a case there. But equally, you know, that's the kind of player who you think, if the path had gone, it's a sliding doors thing. If he'd not gone to Sporting Lisbon, if he'd stayed at Dundee United, what would have happened? And I think I find that very intriguing to think about. I mean, that's the Scotland team that nearly reached the Euros in 2007, 2008. That was a really high quality squad. They were all either at Rangers or Celtic, pretty much, or they were playing in the Premiership down south. And we're getting back to that point now, I think, with this squad.
And a good place, probably, like you say, one of the best places that I can certainly remember. We've touched on it a few times already, and I can't let you go because I know we're both massive fans of it. Talk me through working at a Scottish Ryder Cup, and the Scottish Solheim Cup. You love your golf, links golf in particular as well, because who doesn't just love links golf? But talk me through that, because that is an unbelievable experience. Yeah,
well, I grew up in East Lothian with a golf club in my hand. Played down at the kids' course in North Berwick and at the kids' course at Gullen, and I'm lucky enough. I'm a junior. I was a junior member at Gullen because my grandfather was a member there, and he got me in on the waiting list. And I'm still a member there, so any chance I get, I decamp down, and there's no better place on the planet
to go to God's country and hit some golf balls. And I'm getting my boys into it now as well, and they're quite keen. But I had always tried to get involved in the golf coverage, and then obviously the 2014 Ryder Cup at Gleneagles on the doorstep. Come on, get me involved. Enough we did. And it was fantastic. And I'd worked at Open Championships before that as well. But the Ryder Cup was, I mean, I felt like I was going to Gleneagles every day for about a month before the Ryder Cup. And then the week itself, my second son had been born in May that year. And I'll be honest, I felt pretty guilty about having to go and stay in a hotel for a week. So I drove from Edinburgh every morning up to Gleneagles and back at the end of the day. And we had to be on site at 5 a.m. So I was leaving at about 3:25 every morning, driving up to Gleneagles, getting there 5 o'clock, going right through the day, and then leaving at about 6 o'clock. And by the Friday, by the start of this tournament, I was wrecked. I was in bits. But you were running on adrenaline at that point. And I mean, it was terrific. The weather was brilliant that week. Everyone who was there will say the same thing. It was almost like the perfect week. Europe played great. Everything went for them. That first morning when everyone was crowded around the first tee box, and the stands were full and the sun was just peeping up over the Ochils, and phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And then to do the Solheim Cup 5 years later, that was actually in many ways a little bit more enjoyable because it was a huge deal, but there wasn't as many people there.
Yeah.
So you got to see a bit more. You got to have a little bit more interaction with the golfers. In the Ryder Cup coverage, I wasn't the lead reporter. Mm-hmm. For the Solheim Cup I was, and that was great. And I got to know a lot of the players pretty well by the end of that week. I know Katrina Matthew quite well. I'm fortunate I've dealt with her on a number of occasions, and obviously someone else who comes from East Lothian as well. She's lovely, very straight with you, great to chat to, and it was an amazing finish. Probably the most. It was like watching your team come from 2-1 down to win 3-2 in injury time. They didn't. They should never have won that, and they did, and they pulled it off, and it was extraordinary. And it was just amazing to be there and part of it. And I'm lucky that I've been to Open Championships at Birkdale and at Royal Troon and places like that, and St Andrews, of course, as well. And they are tremendous weeks, phenomenal weeks. And I've been to the Scottish Open, I've been to the French Open. Golf National, where they had the Ryder Cup in 2018. Yeah. But the Ryder Cup itself is an event. It's match play and it's a total one-off. And I know folk who say, it's no real sport. But it's just drama. It's entertainment. And that's what it's all about. It's entertainment. And that's why we're in the business. It's meant to be entertainment. And, it's an absolutely phenomenal thing to be a part of. So, but if I could do golf every day for the rest of my life, I would do. It'd be great. I'm actually starting to write at the moment a golf book, because I've got not much time. I've got a lot of time on my hands, so I'm doing a bit of golf writing at the moment, just for my own personal satisfaction. But I might turn into a book, so that'd be quite cool.
Look forward to that. And then just one final question, actually, because it's kind of, we know you are a proud Scot. So 2014, the Ryder Cup is at Gleneagles as well, and we touched on it before we came on air. The Commonwealth Games in Glasgow as well. Just what a year to be covering sport in Scotland.
Oh yeah, the Commonwealth Games was great too, and you really got that was at the point where I realised that Glasgow had so much to offer as a city. Having lived there, it wasn't just about football. There was lots of other stuff going on as well, and it was I remember going in to watch the judo one afternoon. I wasn't doing any live interviews or any broadcasts for a couple of hours, and we were pretty much given free rein. You could go in and watch any of the events, and I popped into the Hydro or the SECC, I think it was maybe, to watch the judo in Scotland, and it happened to be gold medal day, and I had no idea about judo, not got a clue, but you could tell whether someone had thrown somebody particularly well by the noise of the crowd. And it turned out that Scotland had 4 or 5 competitors in the gold medal matches, and they won every single one. And it was like being in a rock concert. Everyone was going nuts. And I'm thinking, this is brilliant, absolutely terrific. And of course, with the Commonwealth Games, you've got England, Scotland, Wales, and I think the Isle of Man are involved in this. All the kind of home nations have got their own focus, and so there was a lot of focus from a Sky Sports News perspective on England's kind of successes.
I had to point out, Scotland just won 5 gold medals in the judo, and I was there to witness them all. And I was only in there for about an hour and 15 minutes.
Wow.
It was brilliant. I hadn't got a clue what they were doing, no idea, and I've never been to judo before or since. But it was just great to be in there, and everyone was bouncing, and all the people who obviously, all the families were in there, of course.
Yeah.
So all the families of the athletes were absolutely loving it, and there were flags waving everywhere, and it was such a great event again to be part of. And whether we see the Commonwealth Games back in Scotland again, I don't think we will, perhaps. I mean, they've got next year, or in 2 years' time, the track cycling world champion, or the World Cycling Championships in Glasgow, I think 2023. Not just track cycling, but there'll be mountain biking, and there'll be road cycling as well. And that is going to be a huge event for the city and in general for Scotland, because cycling is a sport that's global. It'll be as big as the Commonwealth Games, that whole week of events. And stuff like that, we should embrace when things like that come to this country, because we're very, very lucky, and I think we take for granted sometimes our sporting heritage. The fact that the 150th Open is going to be in St Andrews next year, that is going to, the eyes of the world are going to be on this country. And you've got the Women's Open at Muirfield, which is just down the road from here, of course, and that's a big deal, because it wasn't that long ago that Muirfield wasn't even having female members, and now you've got the Women's Open there. These are massive events. They're great to be part of. They're great to go to. And I think if you're Scottish and you've got an interest in sport, you should be, standing there and getting your tickets to go and see these things, whether it's golf, whether it's cycling, anything like that. Because sometimes we can take for granted it's just about the football or just about the rugby at Murrayfield. And there's so many things that this country is good at doing, and one of them is hosting big events.
Absolutely. Well, here's hoping you're the face of those big events. And
That'd be
years
nice.
to come. Charles, thank you so much for joining me. I
Pleasure.
really enjoyed that.